Welcome back to part 3 of this vlog, all about the exposure triangle and how it works. In this particular part of the video I want to show you ISO, how that works and what it means within the exposure triangle itself, and then I'll talk to you about how we go about using all three together. That's ISO, aperture and shutter speed. But for now I'm going to take a couple of images with different ISO ratings, and then I'm going to show you the difference between them. Now ISO is very different to aperture and very different to shutter speed, but it works in a similar way. This tree is a great example of how to capture the ISO that I want to show you the differences. So the way ISO works is that it is determining how sensitive the camera is to the light that's coming into it. So if I have a very low ISO, then that's got a very low sensitivity to the light that's around in the atmosphere. So what I'm doing is I'm shooting an image with very little light, so there won't be a huge amount of detail, there won't be a huge amount of contrast, but there'll be just enough so that we can see exactly what the tree looks like. With a much higher ISO, for example, what will happen then is the camera becomes much more sensitive to the light that's coming into it, and so it reacts slightly differently, so you end up with slightly more definition and texture within the image, and that will be obvious. But as well as that, one thing that ISO does is, especially with digital photography, is it introduces what we call digital noise, and that's a kind of graining effect which appears in some of the areas where the detail has been reduced because we've increased ISO, and it kind of overexposes a little bit. So what I'm going to try and do is explain that to you, and I'll show you some example images now. As I zoom into the image, however, you'll notice in some of the darker areas that the detail starts to deteriorate slightly, and you'll find that there's a bit of grain, some texturing that's been sort of added that shouldn't be there in the original image, and it's because of a slight degradation in the quality of the image as I increase the ISO. So the camera that I'm using to shoot all this is the Canon 1DS Mark III, and it's quite an old camera now, and so the technology within it is not as good as the technology that's in the newer cameras now. But what that means is you'll start to see the degradation in the image quality because of the increased ISO at much lower ISO ranges. There are cameras on the market now which have a much more increased ISO range. This camera only goes up to 1600 in terms of ISO. But with some cameras now you've got as much as 500,000 or even more ISO, so that's quite an interesting situation, and what that means is that you are getting much more degradation in the image as you increase the ISO further, but also there is technology fitted within the cameras now which means that the noise reduction is increased. So where you have a lot of noise in the image now, that's 1600 ISO. If I was to shoot that with another camera, a much newer camera with better noise reduction within the image, within the camera, then the image would show that. Although aperture, shutter speed and ISO all work independently of one another, if we alter one of those, for example if I increase my ISO, what I'm also doing is slightly increasing the exposure of the image. So to overcome that, I would have to change either my aperture or my shutter speed and reduce that down to reduce down the exposure of the image. Similarly, if I was to increase the size of my aperture, I would have to decrease my ISO or decrease the length of time that the shutter is open for in order to correct the exposure. I hope I've managed to explain the exposure triangle to you fairly adequately. It's not a great experiment, but it does kind of explain the most important point in photography. Once you know the exposure triangle and you learn it and you understand it and you understand how it works, then you can basically take any photo at all. So if you're watching these videos, then I hope you've learnt something from them. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed these videos, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on another video very soon. Bye for now.